Whereas fiction, you have to work on it. You know, it's, you're the guy who's doing half the work or more, and so it's better for you. Read more fiction.
Well, it reminds me, sort of taking that from the other angle, when the movie of The English Patient was made, Charlie Rose was interviewing the director, Anthony Minghella, and the writer of the book on which the movie was based, Michael Ondaatje. And rather complainingly, Anthony Minghella said, well, you know, for Michael Ondaatje to write about the desert, he gives you 2 perfect lines of atmosphere and description, whereas I actually have to take my film crew to the desert. And so it's all there. But I know you work across forms. I think I once heard you say that originally you thought of yourself as a poet before you were a short story writer.
Very much so.
And I know you've we've seen the short story collection first, then you had a poem in the Granta Pakistan issue. I know you're working on a novel now. I wonder whether the sort of absences and presences you were talking about, the things that are on the page as opposed to the things we as the reader create, does that shift across form? Is there more, does a novel leave space for more presence and less absence?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Look, I don't know, because I'm just figuring out this whole novel thing. I've never written one before. But, well, clearly, I'm not sure, because I think we don't want to sort of confuse texture, which is these absences, presences thing, right, and having sort of running room, which means that, you know, in a novel you can have him, you know, Mr. X can go off and have a vacation in the Caribbean, and it's not that relevant to the theme at hand, but you can indulge yourself in this way, because of course, you know, as a writer, sometimes you're just in a mood to send your guy to the Caribbean, and when you're doing a short story, you can't send him to the Caribbean because, you know, you've got to have that very straight narrative arc from A to Z or B, depending on the story. So yeah, I mean, and so in answer to your question, I think I would distinguish it. I would say that the absences presences thing is just, that's the nature of fiction, and it doesn't matter whether it's short story or a novel. The question is more complex and interesting with regard to poetry, because in poetry there's not generally isn't a narrative in the same way. So it's another long discussion, but there is a discussion to be had.
Do sentences work differently in a short story or a novel? I mean, are you aware in some sense that, I mean, the novel is often talked of as being a baggier form. And of course your sentences are anything but baggy, and I wonder whether, and actually, I mean, I love the novel form, of course, I have to sort of...
I think you should be answering this. You're the one who's written about 7 novels.
Well, but now that you're working on it, I do wonder, one of the things with short stories, you put something in page 1, and it can resonate through to the end of the story. You can expect the reader to keep in their memory all the details. Whereas with a novel, if you want an image to work by the end, you can't just have it at the beginning and at the end. It has to be sort of returned to at various points. I wonder whether it means that, are the sentences constructed differently? Is there a different tension, less, more, between
that's
forms?
interesting. First of all, I mean, my immediate response would be that the form is related to the material, so that you can't really talk about the form of short story writing or the form of novel story. You almost, I mean, if done properly, the form will be different depending on what you're writing about. That's true. So that would say one thing. But I think also what you're saying about resonances, that clearly is true, just because we're talking about such a different time period within which the piece will be read. I mean, so clearly, if you're that emphasis has to be different. If you're doing a novel, you know this much better than I do. But if you're doing a novel, obviously, you're going to have to sort of give the reader more of a hint about exactly what the hell this thing is if you're going to refer back. Clearly,
one of the things that I hadn't really thought about in a short story collection only came to mind when you and I were talking earlier this year, or last year. There has been no earlier this year. One of your publishers, who was publishing your book in translation, had decided to rearrange the sequence of your stories. And I don't know about all of you, but on occasion I have been guilty of picking up a collection of short stories, and rather than reading it in the sequence that's there, I look at the table of contents, I think, I don't have that much time, I'll read the shorter story. Now I have more time, I'll read the longer. And of course, when I spoke to you and I saw, you know, when you said, I spend a very long time thinking about that sequence, I suddenly felt, you know, very small. And I realized I'd never thought about sequencing a short story collection. Can you talk with in other rooms are the wonders?
Yeah.
What went through your mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, you know, ideally, except for horrible people like Kamala, you read it from beginning to end, wrapped. And
I read yours from beginning to end.
Don't leave your couch until it's over, damn it. But assuming that you do that, or at least you're allowed to go and have a pizza in the middle. Yeah. Obviously, one thinks about, you know, I thought about, especially because it was sold as a connected collection. I mean, I was hoping that the thing would be sort of more than just a bunch of short stories that happened to be lying in my drawer and they were thrown into a basket. So they're clearly, I mean, I not only was conscious of this as I was writing the stories, but I actually rewrote some of the stories in order to create this sort of larger narrative arc in the stories. And there obviously is some obvious, there's no rational. I can't say like, there's no rational for it. It's in a sort of it's an emotional curve, you know, in which the first story was sort of to grab you by the lapels and make you keep reading, but also had a certain, you know, it has a different, you know, it's attractive in one way, and then at the end, of course, you want to have a sort of dying fall, as I say. Yeah. And so I certainly aimed for that with the last story. And then the other thing is that the story that I thought was least good, I buried it in the middle.
Well, that's good to know, because actually my two favorite stories are the first and the last. So Nawabdin and the Spoilt Man, I thought, oh, that's brilliant, because you start off on this completely brilliant high, and then you end up in a very different, as you say, the dying fall. But again, sort of, you leave it in sort of this sort of sense of, oh my God, that was completely amazing. I'm not saying I didn't like the other stories.
It's okay.
I asked your wife earlier, I said, tell me a difficult question to ask Daniyal.
Oh dear.
Which is always a question any interlocutor should do, is get hold of the spouse. And she said, ask him about the agony of writing, because he doesn't talk about that. But actually, I was struck earlier in the first answer you gave, you said something about that's what makes writing both fun and complicated. And it is, you know, yesterday in your session you talked about the play. Yeah. And of course, these two things don't cancel each other out, the play and the agony. So can you talk about the play and the agony?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, writing is like childbirth. I've never experienced giving birth, but it's like that in that apparently one is designed by nature so that the pain is all forgotten at the end.
Right.
And only the pleasure remains in the mind, more or less. But, you know, clearly writing is sort of a manic-depressive activity in that one, you know, there are moments, and this will be about the same piece of work in my case. There'll be moments when I'll feel the kind of despair that you feel, you know, only like when your sort of girlfriend leaves you or something like that. I mean, it's at that level, and because it's so fundamental, you think, I am a rotten, terrible person. I'm useless. I'm nothing. And then 2 days later, you'll be reading the same thing and sort of thinking, my God, I'm a bloody genius. This is incredible. Who is this guy? So that's all sort of bound up, you know, so yeah. So obviously there is this tremendous, I think good writing has to be playful, you know, because we're in the process of entertaining people. That's what we do. And you know, even writers who are thought of as gloomy, like for example, to give a bad example, would be Kafka, who's, you know, seems, it's said to be dark or whatever, but in the texture of it is hilarious. I mean, he's very, very funny. And similarly, I think that in my work, when I'm doing it, I think I need to charge myself up to the point as I'm in the process of writing, where I'm sort of like, you know, dancing on the keyboard. It's almost like playing piano. You're sort of sitting there, trung, 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 you know, and having fun with it. And that's a necessary part of the process. But then the sort of the judgment, that one starts judging oneself, and of course then you often think this is terrible, and then I've come to moments of profound despair, entirely out of proportion with the importance of the activity. I mean, I'm only writing stories.
And now a novel. Will you tell us a little about the novel you're working on now?
Yeah, I will. I'm working on something set entirely in New York, without any Pakistani characters in it, and without quite consciously, I'm not going to allow the word Pakistan to appear in the book. And it's about, every book is basically, there has to be a girl and a guy in a book, or a guy and a guy and a girl, whatever. So of course there's a love story. Without that, fiction is almost impossible. But more than that, it's a story about money, and it's an attempt to sort of consider the way in which money, sort of how fundamental money and things are to our being and our character. I remember when I was younger, I had an uncle, or I called him uncle. He wasn't really my uncle, and I was sort of saying something about money, who needs money or whatever, and he said, "Don't ever say that, because money is the thing that most people give their whole lives for, and most people spend their lives toiling to have enough of it to put together some bloody food in their mouth. So don't badmouth this stuff." And I think that I'd like to try to approach and sort of to approach that subject in that way, to really come to to consider how fundamental money is to the ways in which we make and unmake our lives.
Now I know you talked about this yesterday, but I think a lot of people who are here probably weren't there yesterday. There was at one point 2 novels on the go.
Exactly. I was writing a novel started, and I will finish it, but I was writing a novel set in Lahore in the 70s, which is when I was a kid there, and for me, and I bet for about half this audience, the 70s was sort of the golden era, and the moral rot had not yet set in, or was just starting to set in, and so sort of I was indulging my desire to dabble and play in that sunny period, and then at some point, this other story, my mother had passed away, and she used to live in New York. And this other subject has kept pressing itself upon me. I had this strong desire to sort of go back and to live in live in New York, and to be in that place, and to write about those restaurants and the way the streets look in the morning when it's just been watered, and that kind of thing. And I kept fighting it, which is what one does, because you're thinking, oh God, I can't do that. I've got to finish this bloody thing that I'm on. And then at some point I just succumbed. And it was lovely, that moment when I said to myself, it's okay, just do it, it's not a problem. Yeah. And so that's what happened.
There was a moment yesterday when you were referred to, I think entirely erroneously, as an expat. And even as this, claim was made about you, I was thinking, is she saying he's an expat when he's in Pakistan, or is she saying he's an expat when he's in America? Because of course you are an expat in neither, you are of both places. But I wonder, as a writer, so you've written one collection set in Pakistan, now you're working on a novel set in America. Do you feel, when you're writing about these worlds, do you feel yourself equally an insider or outsider to both the worlds when you write about them?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it depends on what. Clearly, when I'm writing about Nawabuddin Electrician, he's less, part of my everyday world than, a lawyer in New York City, because I used to be a lawyer in New York City, so I've actually been inside that skin. But I write stories. For example, I write stories. My mother owned a farm in Wisconsin, and I've written a number of stories set in Wisconsin about the farm people there. And in that case, I think I feel equally or even more distant from the characters that I'm describing, because I've lived very intimately with the people at my farm, whereas my relations with those people in Wisconsin has been less close. So it's not really about which country it is, because I think I'm pretty much completely comfortable in both, but rather it's about my relation to the individual characters.
Right. I was asked a question today, which I'm going to ask you before we hand it over to the audience for their questions, which was, why do writers come to festivals?
Why do writers? Oh, for the adulation, of course.
There you go, all right. So it's time for some adulation, or to prove him wrong, and some tremendously
really
harsh
snippy.
criticism. So could we have questions of people who would raise their hand? The lady in the front row. Is there a mic going around for... There's a mic coming around. It's a pretty big hall, so you'd probably need to use that.
I've tried my hand at writing. In fact,
I think you need to speak up into it, yeah?
I've tried my hand at writing. In fact, I had a story, concept for a story in my head. And I started to write it, and the first 2 chapters just came really easily. and then you sit there and you get stumped and you don't know what to do with the rest of the chapters 3 and 4, although you know how it's going to end. So, some parts in writing are really easy to do, and some parts you just don't know what's going to happen next. And I was just wondering, do you ever experience this? And if so, what do you do about it?
Absolutely. No, that's, I think, very much part of the process. What generally happens to me is that, you come in, you've got this great idea, this is going to be so easy. And then you sort of get whacked into about, a third of the way through, and then you just totally run into a brick wall, and you're like disgusted, and you're never going to be able to write again about anything, not just about this thing. But then at the same time, you've got this ending, which is the moment I know the story is I'm going to make it, is when I get the ending. And the ending is always the moment. It's like, beginnings and endings are like writing poetry in that they demand inspiration. With both, at least in my case, with beginnings and endings, there has to be that eureka moment where you're like, bring, and it comes, and then you know. And when it's in the beginning, that's where the story begins. That's the germ. And at the generally, and at the end, of course, you're generally about a third of the way through, and as you say, you get the ending, and then that's when you have to become a soldier, and you just have to tromp through, and you have to trust yourself and just grind it out, and that's just part of the process. At least for me, that's just part of the process. Yeah. You have to do that grunt work.
If I can just add a little thing to that, there's a little thing I've cut out and pasted on my desk, which is Alan Bennett talking about his play The Habit of Art, which is about Auden, W.H. Auden. And there's a line he gives Auden where Auden says, the most important thing for a writer is will. Not talent, not love, not originality, though of course you hope you have some of these things, but will. And I think that's just it, to be able to get past that. When you come to the end of that chapter 2, do you have the will to write chapter 3?
Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you.
Other questions?